Good afternoon, and welcome to NAPA's webinar on how to make data more practical for your fleets. My name is Molly Steele. I work in marketing and communications at WEX, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's panelists. To my right, we have Bernie Kavanagh. Bernie is WEX's Senior Vice President and General Manager for Large Fleet. Next to Bernie is Kurt Thearling. Kurt is WEX's Vice President of Analytics. And at the end, we have Jerry Antl. Jerry Antl heads up our large marketing team. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks, Molly.
Okay, so let's get started. I'll go ahead and pass the presentation over to our first speaker, Bernie Kavanagh. Bernie.
Great. Thanks, Molly. And thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start by thanking NAFA for hosting this event. When I think about NAFA, I think about an organization who has a lot of the same core values as WEX. At WEX, we believe in integrity. Our open, honest, and transparent way earns us the respect from all of our customers and partners. Innovation, when you think about innovation, we create a culture of creativity and thought leadership. Execution, we're not happy until we deliver extraordinary results. Relationships, we view the world through our customers and partners' eyes. And the community is very important to us, and we want to be strong leaders in the world to create opportunities for many others. So a little bit of background about WEX. So WEX got its start back in 1983 as Wright Express. Many of you know us as that name. And we pioneered the proprietary closed-loop fuel card network. We operate in three very distinct lines of business. The fleet card, which we just spoke of. Our second line of business is our travel line of business, where we are the back-end settlement agent for virtually all of the online travel agencies around the world. And our health line of business, where we handle electronic solutions for benefit administration. So think about things like HSA accounts or FSA accounts. Some numbers about the organization. We have roughly 2,700 employees worldwide. We have offices in 10 countries, and in 2016, we proudly broke through the $1 billion mark in revenue. On the fuel side, we have over 180,000 accepting locations. On the virtual side, we have operate in over 200 countries and territories. And in the health space, we have 225,000 employer groups, and we serve over 24 million healthcare consumers. So what this really brings us is a lot of information and a lot of data. We're going to talk a lot about data today and that information and how valuable that can be. So we'll kind of just drill a little bit down into the fleet side now and talk about some of that. So when you think about analytics, which is what we're going to talk mostly about today, it all starts with data. Security is paramount to everything that we do. At WEX, we have the richest and most secure data set available. We process over 450 million fuel transactions a year. We have over 10.5 million fuel cards in circulation, and we have over 500,000 customers. So we have a lot of data. And we start by analyzing the fuel consumption. When you start to look at fuel consumption, you start to see things like driver behavior and driver metrics. And that's geared towards a driver and how they're acting. When you layer on top of that some information like vehicles, so maintenance data, maybe some telematics data, now you start to get a richer data set. And what you start with there is some reporting. So we've got some basic reporting, we've got some enhanced reporting by pulling that all together. But what we really want to focus on now is how we take that basic reporting and we turn it into analytics. I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Thanks, Bernie. So analytics means different things to different folks. It means using data to answer questions that are meaningful to you. It can be maybe more academic in its approach, which is finding patterns in the data. From my point of view, I tend to think of using data to generate insights. The key thing with all of these definitions, though, is the data. The data is the foundation that we work with. It is the raw material that you start out with and you turn into something more interesting. Historically, data has changed quite a bit over the last 100 years or so. When Ronald Fisher, one of the pioneers of modern statistics, did his work in the early 20th century, he was writing things down in paper notebooks with pen and paper. His ability to collect data was limited by the number of pages that he had in that notebook. The volumes of data that Fisher worked with were infinitesimal compared with what we have today. Modern databases, modern computers give us the ability to work with large volumes of numbers and other forms of data. But one of the things that you might have heard about is this term big data. What does big data mean? Well, basically it's anything and everything that you could possibly collect and turn into a data set. It is every tweet that you've ever seen. It is audio. It is video. It is text messages. From a fleet manager's point of view, it could be the video from an IDCAM camera. It could be all of the dispatch logs that you're dealing with. It could be accident reports. All of this rich data, which is not in the form of numbers anymore, but is in the form of video files and other things, makes it much harder to analyze, but also creates a lot of great opportunities to do things that you've never been able to do. One of the ways that I look at sort of the modern age of data analysis is this the age of the sensor. There is so much new data being collected that had never been collected before. It's going to open up a lot of opportunities, but we're going to have to figure out how to approach analyzing it first. And some of the things we'll talk about today will touch on ways that we do that. So the process of data analysis is fairly simple from my point of view. You start out with that raw material, you get it ready to be analyzed, and then you start exploring it. You try to find things in that data set that are interesting. Those insights hopefully resonate with the people who matter, with you, your boss, and so on. But one of the nice things about coming up with these insights is that you generate new questions. So you answer one question, and it'll generate 5 more. And you'll loop around doing this over and over and over again till the point where you have some insights that are really solid. They work really well, they're meaningful, they will generate value. It's not simply a matter of coming up with one answer. It's doing it over and over again until the answers that you come up with are really valuable.
You know, Kurt, one of the interesting things I find about this graphic is the fact that, going back to your example of the pencil and paper days, back then you were really limited into that circular loop, how many insights you can kind of bring back and explore, which really limited the amount of action items you were able to create. So these days it feels like that loop is more continual and it's kind of recurring over time.
That's a great point. I worked on projects where you were lucky to get one analysis done given limited computing power and so on. Nowadays, you can do these things over and over again. You can do 100 different analyses in a single day. By the time you do your 100th analysis, you're going to be much better at problem solving than you were when you did your first.
So the topic of loop keeps coming up, and I just got a question. Bernie, we run on a closed loop network. How does this closed loop network benefit our fleets when collecting data?
Sure. So if you think about a closed loop network, basically what that means is we own the entire process. So we're the issuer, we're the settlement agent, but more importantly, it's our proprietary spec that's released to the merchants, and that controls which data we get back. So we're able to make sure that we're getting the right data, we're actually able to make sure that it's accurate data, and if it's not, then we can go back with our spec and get that, rather than other folks who have more of an open loop network where they're relying on a third party to collect data, and they may be missing data sets or they may have to kind of fill in some blanks. So it's a lot more of a secure process.
Great.
Yeah, the kinds of data that we have access to is much richer than it would be if we were just using a general purpose credit card. That is actually something that, from a data analysis point of view, I love. I like having more details. I like to know fuel grades. I like to know all the volume information. I like to know all the pricing information, location information. That all gets mixed together and allows us to do this exploration as we see here.
We hear that a lot from our fleets. If you're only collecting level 3 data at 30 to 60% of your transactions, you're missing out on a lot of that data, which really limits your ability to have insights into your fleet's transactions.
Absolutely true.
I think what's been really neat about this process too is we run a lot of user groups with our customers and partners, and you can give them all the same set of data and they go through the same exploratory process, but their insights are much different and their call to action is much different. And then when they start to share ideas with each other, then they come out with even more ideas. So that loop is not even just within a singular unit. That loop is also within an industry as well.
That's true. We work with a lot of customers to make sure that the insights we come up with aren't things that we find interesting, but that the customers find interesting. And then once you have the insights, it's not simply a matter of taking a look at them and sort of creating a PowerPoint and being done with it all. You want to turn those insights into action. So if you're doing some sort of risk modeling for your drivers, it's not simply a matter of coming up with the factors that affect that risk. You actually want to do something about it. So finding those drivers who have the high risk profile, automatically scheduling them to have, say, a training course so that you alleviate some of the problems that you've identified using your analytics model. That's the follow-through that's really important. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. We'll look at an example of the ways that you can reach out to drivers and actually change behavior given the insights that you have. So when I think about analytics, I usually like to start simply. I like to start simply and do things like counting. How many X's do I have? How many drivers do I have? How many vehicles do I have? How many transactions do I have? There's a couple things that you like to see when you're doing this. One is if you can get the data so you can count it, you can do much more sophisticated analysis. It sets a great foundation. The second thing is if the counts that you're generating are consistent with your view of the world, you start to believe in that data. So this is an example of a very simple dashboard that we built for spending for some of our customers. So if you look at something like this and you said, okay, that $20 million of spend that we saw last year, that's what I expected to see. That's how much I paid in terms of my bills. If you look at the number of cards, yeah, we have about 7,500 cards in service. If that's happening, you're starting to believe in this data. You can start to drill down a little bit deeper, maybe look at it state by state. Do you have 510 drivers in Texas? If you do, then you're going to feel comfortable with not only the data that you have, but the analysis that comes out of that data. This is critical. Data analysis often involves identifying new trends, things that you didn't know before. So you need to start trusting in that analysis, and building upon that solid foundation is where you get that trust. Well, let's start looking at some more interesting questions that you can look at the data. Here is an example of a set of transactions associated with one individual driver. One of the things that you might be interested in is how does that driver compare to other drivers? Is this a good driver in terms of how they're spending company money or not? So all of those data points, those X's at the top of the screen in red, are purchases that are made over a period of time. On the axis on the left, it's how much they spent per gallon. Well, were those good purchases or not? Well, one of the things you can do is start looking at comparisons. How do they compare to other folks? How do they compare to alternatives to the purchases that they made? One of the things that we did was we started to look at not only individual data points, but we started to average them. So for every purchase that was made, we looked at all other possible purchases that could have been made within 5 miles of that transaction. Then we averaged the prices for the gasoline sales within those 5 miles and show that as a blue line. One of the things that you can see here is that this driver is buying expensive gasoline. They're quite a bit above that average. So we don't know if it's whether the driver liked the coffee at this station or they had a rewards card at this particular merchant, but they're spending company money maybe a little inefficiently. We'll get back to how we might change this behavior a little bit later, but one of the things that you can see here is that you've got something that you probably want to deal with. Well, how about something even more important, something like theft and fraud? Well, this requires a little bit more analysis and starting to string data points together so that the analysis that you do is a little bit more complicated. Here we're looking at miles associated with a particular vehicle. The line in gray, sort of at the bottom, is the number of miles that have been driven given the information that we're pulling off the odometer. That could be manually entered by the driver at the pump, or it could be pulled off of a telematics device. The blue line, on the other hand, represents the number of miles given the amount of gasoline that was purchased. So if we know the fuel efficiency for that vehicle, that it's getting 11 miles per gallon, and they buy 10 gallons of gasoline, they should be able to drive 110 miles. Well, how many miles did they really drive? That's when it starts to get interesting. You would expect that these two curves would hug each other in a perfect world. And that's what's happening up front. These two lines are on top of each other. That means that every gallon of gasoline that you bought went into the tank and was used to drive that vehicle. But then you notice that the curves start to diverge. What's going on here? Well, what's happened is there's some theft going on. So the driver bought some gasoline and they didn't necessarily go into the vehicle. It certainly didn't go into miles that were used on that vehicle. And then it stayed sort of static for a while. Both curves go up sort of the same amount. What we think is happening here is that the driver is watching. They're watching to see if anybody has said anything to them. Did anybody notice that this theft that they thought they got away with had been detected? Well, after about 2 weeks, nobody said anything. So this driver starts to take advantage of the fact that they've got a credit card and they can buy as much gasoline as they want. In fact, within a 1 week period, or actually a several day period, they bought more gasoline that didn't go in the vehicle than did go into the vehicle. Approximately 2/3 of the gallons associated with this driver went somewhere else other than the vehicle.
Kurt, I really find the upward spiral interesting. To me, that really indicates lost savings, right? That's funds that the company spent that could have been avoided if, for example, on May 2nd, somebody had dug into it a little bit faster and really found out that there was some fraud going on.
That's true. One of the nice things about analytics is that you can start to build this into real-time detection and automation systems. So this was a data exploration exercise. We were doing this after the fact and noticed this problem. We noticed it close enough where actually we could work with the fleet manager, and they talked to this driver and worked through the situation. But you might want to build this automatically into a set of algorithms which notify a manager that something is going on. When that first transaction happened and you didn't notice that, or you did notice that the gasoline didn't go into the vehicle, you might want to reach out to that driver. It could do a couple things. One, it could prevent subsequent fraud from happening, but also the word will get out among drivers that somebody's paying attention, that somebody is watching the transactions, and if you do something wrong, you're going to be held accountable. And I think that's a big part of this. It's the halo effect. It's not just the driver that we're talking about here, but it's all the other drivers who will hear that the company is paying attention, and you have to be careful.
It's the old adage of people do what's inspected, not expected.
Absolutely.
Right? This is nice, too, because if this were just a data set, if you think about that slide you showed before with all the numbers, I wonder if it'd be as easy to find where the outliers were. But this is just a very clear visual representation of here's something that just doesn't look quite right. Right? We think you need to look into this. We may not understand everything that happened here, but as somebody who's, this is their money, I think they want to look a little further.
I think that's an important point about modern data analysis. A lot of it has a visual component to it. It's not simply a matter of coming up with an insight and having an aha moment. It's presenting those insights so that other people can do something about it. Showing it to your boss, being able to share it with your team so that there's learning going on, that knowledge transfer is happening from this analysis. That's critical. And painting a picture about what's going on is one way to do that.
You no longer have to email out spreadsheets.
That's true. So let's look at something a little bit more complicated. The kinds of analysis we've looked at before are sort of basic arithmetic kinds of things, maybe a little bit of statistics thrown in, but modern data science incorporates a lot of techniques from computer science, machine learning, and so on, and we'll go through one of those examples right now. This is some data that came from one individual merchant in the state of Ohio over a 2-year period, and what they did was they gave us every single transaction that had been processed at that merchant. One of the things you notice is all of the transactions are the same. They classified every single transaction, gasoline, diesel, a coffee purchase, as general merchandise, which isn't very interesting from a fleet manager's point of view. If they want to know how much gasoline was purchased at this merchant, they wouldn't be able to do it. It would all be blurred together. So what can you do about this? Well, I can actually use some modern machine learning algorithms to start taking this data apart. You can start looking at data that you have from other merchants and seeing the patterns that you can find in that data. So we might want to look at units versus price for other transactions. One of the things you'll notice right away is things that are classified as other. A coffee, an oil change, diesel exhaust fluid. They tend to have units as integers, especially small integers. You buy 1 cup of coffee. You don't buy 10.27 cups of coffee. 10.27 actually looks more like the number of gallons that you purchase. So that's one way of separating sort of the general merchandise from fuel. But once you look at fuel, you can start to see differences between diesel and gasoline. Diesel purchases tend to be larger volumes. So you see that sort of, there are some smaller ones, but the larger purchases are diesel. Diesel is here coded in blue, while gasoline is coded in yellow. You can also look at price. Price doesn't show as much variation. There's sort of a bit of overlap there, especially in certain locations. But one of the things that really helps understanding what's going on here is looking at history. So if a vehicle has been filled up with regular for the past year, if they're buying fuel again, it's likely that it's regular. If they bought diesel in the past, they're buying diesel today. So putting all of these things together, you can create a classification model which actually takes every one of those transactions shown in gray at the top and separates it out into different buckets. In particular, we're going to look at buckets of diesel versus gasoline and then other. What you see here is what you would expect. Most everything is a fuel transaction. You're either seeing gasoline in yellow or diesel in blue, a little bit of gray, some cups of coffee, some oil changes, and so on. But it's pretty small compared with the overall fuel purchase behavior. Compared with what's at the top where everything is blurred together, you have much more detail at the bottom. And you can use that detail to try to understand what's going on at this station and what your drivers are buying when they're buying from the station.
I have a question, Kurt. Kurt, you show one back.
Okay.
One more? Yeah. So you show 3 different examples of data sets, one with 1, 2, and 3.
Yep.
Can you explain where fleet managers should start and what they should be looking at, the ones who are new to data collection?
I go back to the original point, which is counting. So how much fuel is happening? Maybe more important, how much other transactions are you allowing to happen? Typically, when you use a fuel card, you're not allowing non-fuel transactions, but sometimes you do. How much of that is happening? What can you learn maybe from other stations that would tell you sort of how prevalent is it buying a cup of coffee or donuts or buying something that the company gets value out of, an oil change or diesel exhaust fluid or something else which is associated with operating that vehicle. Just getting those counts, getting a sense of scale. How much are you talking about here? Is this something that you really need to be concerned about? You can then lead into finding these special cases where you have stations that aren't providing you the data that you need to. But focus on the places that you do have the data, and then see if you're looking at a problem that you really should care about. The counting question gets to what I usually think of as meaningful answers. You want to have something that you care about, and so you can start doing some of the simple counting. You'll find there's some things that are so small, so insignificant that you really don't care about it. You're not going to care about it initially. You may get to it later, but focus on things that you do care about, and probably more importantly, focus on things your boss cares about. Come up with an answer that they like to see. I still remember one of my very first jobs doing data science. I was talking with the guy who was hiring me, or about to hire me, and I asked him the question, how many people work for you? And he sort of hesitated for a minute, and he said, oh, about 7,000. And you could tell it bugged him that he didn't know the answer to that question. He didn't know the exact answer to the question. And we talked a little bit about it, and he said, well, we don't have the systems that are connected to the data and so on. So one of the very first things that I did when I joined that organization was I pointed a business intelligence tool at the HR and the payroll databases. And a week later, I went up to him and I told him he has 7,625 people working for him. And so I got that answer by doing some very simple addition, by pulling data out of the database. But back to my point about trust, he knew that we could get that answer, and he knew that he could trust me and he could trust the system to get him answers to questions like that. That was a great foundation for my relationship with him.
Those are great examples, and this is a great slide. So we will be sharing the presentation with you after the conclusion, so keep that in mind.
Okay. So we talked a lot about data. Well, data is growing dramatically. One of the ways that it is growing is by adding additional data sources. In the work that we've done so far, we've added VIN decoders and knowing details about the vehicle. We've started to pull in telematics data. Telematics data, the richness that it can provide is significant, and we're looking at adding that to the mix.
And recent studies would show that roughly 35 to 40% of all commercial vehicles at this point have some sort of a telematics device installed. They suggested in the next 3 to 5 years that number could get to 65 to 70%. So if you think about the amount of information that's coming back, so no longer is it just manually entered, no longer is it just tied to fuel. Now you're starting to get real-time data coming back from a vehicle, starting to track where that vehicle is. The accuracy is just amazing with all the information that comes back. And that extends beyond just your standard vehicles as well. As many of you know, by the end of this year, the ELD mandate goes into effect, which means all of the larger vehicles need to have some sort of an electronic logging device on there. And that's going to be another layer of data. What that also does is it gets kind of into the security aspect of things, keeping drivers safe on the road, understanding how many hours they've been driving. So the data really provides a lot of benefit.
And it just adds to the richness. We're talking about incorporating geographic data, so mapping and route data, what's at the location, images of those locations. You could pull things off of an in-cab camera and feed it to the analysis. What would that tell you? Maybe from accident reconstruction purposes, that could be useful. But let's start out with something simple. We talked a little bit about fraud earlier. One of the ways that telematics will play a role in data analysis is augmenting the fraud analytics process.
I have a question for Bernie. around driver safety.
Sure.
Driver safety is a really hot topic in the industry.
Yeah.
How can fleet managers apply telematics data in best practices around safety?
Sure. So I think the telematics data falls into a couple different buckets, and I think safety is certainly one of the bigger buckets that people are focusing on now. So there could be some basic information like speeding, harsh braking, harsh accelerating, all things that would suggest that you have a driver who may not be driving a vehicle as safely as you'd like them to. And that then allows you to take action and get some training for that driver and to stem any future incidents that could happen. It also then gets to a next level where you can put things like geofences on. So maybe you've got a dangerous part of an area that you drive through that you don't want drivers in. Maybe there's a high accident rate at a certain intersection, and you may be trying to train drivers to stay away from that. So you can put a geofence around there. You may get alerted every time somebody goes through that intersection. And again, it's coaching. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. I think there's the information that you can obtain from the vehicles, but I think more importantly, it's the training that then goes with that to make sure that we stem that behavior, it doesn't happen again, and then the roads just become safer for everybody.
Thanks.
One of the things that you can also do is you can feed that data into a scorecard for every driver, collecting the things that you care about. How much do you care about how they spend money? Maybe you care more about how they spend on premium fuel than you do about high-priced fuel. You don't want to reroute drivers to find the cheapest station, but when they're buying gasoline, you don't want them to buy premium fuel. You can also tie in safety factors into that. So you may have an A driver who's getting A's across the board and a C driver, and the reason they're a C isn't because they're spending money ineffectively. They're doing a good job there, but they're driving maybe in an unsafe fashion.
Absolutely.
So let's take a look at some of the telematics data and how we can mix that together with fuel purchase data. So you start out with the fuel purchase data. You have information about the station, how much you're spending, the odometer reading, all of the stuff that you would expect to get from that transaction. But then let's talk about adding in the GPS coordinates associated with the telematics device. This can tell you some interesting things, like where that vehicle is when that fueling transaction took place. The obvious question here is you want to make sure that that vehicle is at the pump when you're spending that money. And in this example, we actually found that it wasn't. There were 3 circumstances here where the vehicle was about 2.3 miles away from the pump. What's going on? So this can be one of those situations where you start digging a little bit deeper and start looking at the big data aspects and start pulling in image data. In particular, image data associated with the street map or the street view from Google Maps. So take those coordinates about where the vehicle is located when the purchase took place and look around, see what was there. Well, when we did that, we found that the vehicle was at a residential address. It wasn't at a gas station. There were no pumps nearby. And so what we figured out was that the driver drove home with the company vehicle, got out of the company vehicle, took the company credit card, got in their personal vehicle, and drove a couple miles away with that personal vehicle to a gas station, filled it up. They did it over and over and over again. It wasn't until we put these 2 data sets together that we were actually able to see what was going on. And as with the previous example, this driver had to sit down with their manager, and unfortunately for them, they no longer work for this company.
So those are 2 different people?
They are.
Ah.
They are.
It's amazing the accuracy of the information that you pull back down, and you can pinpoint to a location at a residential and at a station and see that there's that far of a difference off.
There's a couple things going on here. Certainly the accuracy of the telematics devices is growing dramatically. We're working on a project right now where we're mapping every single gas pump in the United States using all of the telematics associated with the vehicles that are at the pump at the time. We have a feeling that we'll be able to get that map down to about 6 feet for every single pump in the United States. That provides us with a good data set to work with. We'll be able to determine whether or not the data or the vehicle is at the pump when we think it should be. The other nice thing is that you're able to tap into all of this other data. You give Google a GPS coordinate, it will show you a picture of what's happening there. Is this a residential address? Are you on a highway? It'll even tell you the speed limit on that highway if you're looking at a road. So the amount of data that you can start layering on and mixing in with what you have to work with is growing dramatically, and the costs are infinitesimal compared with what they would before. If you wanted to know the speed limit on every road in the United States, trying to collect that data 10 years ago would have been almost impossible. These days, you pay Google a few cents and you're done.
So what you're telling me is if my son says he's at the library and the vehicle says it's not at the library, I probably should believe the vehicle.
I believe the vehicle these days.
Interesting. Great.
So let's go back to that example where we had a driver who was buying some expensive gasoline. Well, the analysis showed us that this driver isn't spending money very effectively. Well, what do you do about this? This then gets into that point I made at the beginning, which is how do you turn insight into action? Well, one of the things that you can do is you can reach out to this driver and you can yell at them. You can yell at them in a number of ways. You can sit them down in your office and give them a hard time. Or, and this is what we tested, we looked at sending them a text message. Can we simply say, you know, your vehicle doesn't require premium. Please don't buy premium anymore. Is that an effective way to change behaviors? Turns out it is. We actually ran a test using 100 drivers. The red line shows the costs that these drivers were incurring before we started to do something about it. The blue line was the benchmark that we were comparing them against. As you can see, the red line is significantly above the blue line, a lot of waste going on. Then we sent these 100 drivers a text message, one text message. Within 24 hours, 84% of the drivers had stopped buying premium gasoline. You'll notice that those two lines sit on top of each other after that first message went out. That was a dramatic shift in behavior, much more than we expected. There still were 16% of the drivers who didn't change their behavior, and we followed up with them. Sometimes you need to maybe be a little more emphatic in your message, use all caps in your text message, or maybe they sit down with their manager and they read the Riot Act. But the nice thing about analytics is that you're able to figure out what's going on, which drivers have changed, which drivers still need to make the change, and then you can reach out to them and be done.
I'm going to go back to that safety topic again. Bernie, with the text messaging and driving, how do we go around this, or fleet managers work with those notifications?
Sure. So I think a lot of what we've talked about today, we don't just develop in a vacuum. We're developing with our partners and with our customers. And safety is certainly an issue that is front and center in the industry. And I think when we looked at the text messaging, we worked with a lot of our customers to say, when is the appropriate time? Do you allow text messaging? Do you want to do it early? Do you want to do it late? Do you want to do it real time? And we've got a lot of flexibility built into the system, so we can do it based on whatever the customers would need to really change the behavior, but also, more importantly, keep them safe on the road.
And as part of the test, we looked at a variety of ways of delivering that message. We looked at when we delivered it. We made sure it wasn't too early so that drivers were off the clock. We made sure it wasn't too late, that they weren't on the road. We looked at delivering it via email as opposed to SMS. We also looked at sending the message to the manager for the manager to deliver directly. The idea is that you want to evaluate what's the most effective way to change these behaviors. For some fleets, it will be one way. Another fleet, it will be a different way. But if you have the flexibility built into the system where you can communicate in the most effective ways, you'll be fine.
I think what's great about this also is it takes a lot of the work out of the fleet manager's hands. Right? We understand that everybody's doing more with less, and some folks just don't have the time, as rich as the data can be, to really scour through it and figure out where they need to focus their time and their energy on to find some savings. And this is just a great example of how analytics can take a lot of that work out of the way for you.
Yeah, here we're looking at only 100 drivers, which is probably something that we could feasibly do by hand, sort of. You give the fleet manager a list of drivers and they contact them directly. But if you start doing this for other kinds of behaviors, not just premium fuel, but you also look at high price fuel, bad odometer entries, poor safety record, things like that, the amount of messages that could be going out, the things that you need to keep track of will grow dramatically. And so automating the process, not only automating the messaging, but automating the watching to make sure that the behavior changes that you want to see are happening, that's quite a bit of effort. And by automating it, you take that out of the hands of the fleet manager.
Great. Thanks, Kurt. Well, I think all these great insights really beg the question, how is this relevant to my organization? And at WEX, we've got a really dynamic customer insights team. They're constantly out in the field. They're talking to customers. They're learning from the fleets. They're determining how they operate their vehicles. And it's these customer insights that really led us to develop a data analytics capability. Now, it may not surprise those of you who are in the fleet industry to learn that on average, about one full day out of a 5-day work week is used specifically for reporting and analytics. So those fleets that are more complex, hypothetically, spend even more time on analytics and reporting. And as organizations change over time and as things like mergers and acquisitions occur, this can create bottlenecks in an organization. over 60% of fleets are either currently actively looking for or already have analytics capabilities. So again, because this is such an important trend and a hot topic, it's really been a focus for a lot of our customers.
And when you look at those 60%, less than half of them are actually doing anything right now. So there's a lot of opportunity for fleets to move forward sort of from the first step. One of the things that I've learned over the last couple decades is that you can take advantage of analytics that is happening in other industries. One of the nice things about not being on the leading edge of all of this is that you can look at industries like financial services. You can look at industries like telecommunications. They've been doing analytics for quite a while now and borrow some of the best practices, some of the tools and techniques that they're using.
Absolutely.
And use it to move forward quickly.
Yeah, and I think what's happening too is as a lot of these data trends become more prevalent in society, as things like tracking a vehicle to tracking what you bought at the grocery store last week become more commonplace, organizations are starting to demand that we become more analytical in our roles. So this is something that as it occurs more in society is going to be more of a demand from a business perspective as well. So what is it that fleet managers want? Well, many of our customers at WEX that we talk to often tell us that their most important assets are their vehicles and their employees. Both of these are important to operations, right? They're important to get the job done. But also, in addition, taking a look at these two factors, they can also become problematic if not managed. So, it's easy as a fleet, or relatively easy, to do something like take the average cost of fuel and figure out, are your drivers purchasing above or below that threshold? That's relatively easy to do. But there's also the human factor to consider, right? So if you have a driver, and let's just say this driver, let's call him Kurt, right? So Kurt likes to go and fuel at a particular fuel station because he loves the coffee there. So he goes there every morning, and Kurt loves the coffee there. It's about 1.5 miles out of the way, not really a big deal, right? Cost of fuel is maybe a couple pennies more than the other location, but Kurt's a good guy. He means well. He's not trying to fleece the company. He's just going out of his way. And maybe Kurt likes to chat up the cashier in the morning too, right? So he spends a couple minutes pouring his coffee, chatting a little bit before he gets on the road. If you multiply that factor over an entire fleet, right, obviously this starts to become a bigger issue. So you might catch Kurt, you sit him down, you talk to him, he's a good guy, he understands, he changes his behavior. But is that really scalable? Is that really something that you can change over your entire organization? So that's when that human factor starts to come into play, and that's when the old methods that we used to have in the past are no longer good enough, because if you want to influence change, you've got to do more than running Excel spreadsheets. So how do you do this? How do you influence change, and how do you take best practices and really start to apply them towards your fleet? One thing you can do is you can go out and you can hire yourself a data scientist. Now there's a couple things I want to let you know about this strategy. Number one, data scientists are very expensive. Number two, you may not be able to justify the headcount. Number three, you'd be lucky to even find a person like this.
Yeah, they're pretty specialized skill sets. If you look at modern data science, it isn't just statistics. There's more to it than that. It certainly includes statistics. I say that's sort of one leg of the three-legged stool. But there's also programming, and not programming the way Microsoft is programming, but programming in languages like Python and R, which are built to do data manipulation, data modeling. There's some great stuff out there. It's amazing what's happened over the last decade. The nice thing is that these tools are open source, so you can access to them. But as Jerry pointed out, finding the people who can work with these tools is hard. And then there's the third part, which is this data artistry, the stuff that we touched on earlier about painting a picture and doing data visualization so that you can view the results. If you can find somebody who is good with statistics, good with programming, and is a data artist, you've got a very special person, but they're pretty hard to find.
Absolutely, and I think if I was somebody like Bernie over here, Bernie, how many kids do you have again? You've got 3 kids, right?
3 kids, yeah.
3 kids, and I think a couple of them, if I remember correctly, are about to go off to college.
2 in high school, yes.
And have you looked into college tuition yet?
No.
It's cheap, right? It's not too expensive.
Yeah.
A couple thousand a year, maybe?
Couple, yeah.
Couple thousand, yeah.
A day.
So I think if I were Bernie over here, I'd be encouraging all 3 of my kids to become data scientists.
We're going to look into that.
Especially if you want to retire at any point in the near future.
All of my nieces and nephews are getting this message from me. If you want a good, solid career, data science is the place to go.
Yeah, that's good. So if you don't have the funds to basically fund your own data scientist, there's a lot of analytics programs out there that can leverage this capability for you. So at WEX, we have our own in-house data scientists, and they really feed analytics at WEX. So using these analytics programs, you can do things like create driver scorecards, right? You can start to identify savings opportunities by driver. You can do things like gamification, where you can start to rate your drivers and really have them understand where they rate compared to other drivers in the organization. These capabilities can do things like create dashboard views. So gone are the days where you have to do manual reporting. Gone are the days of creating manual reports. At the click of a mouse, you can have access to things like the cost outlier report that Kurt showed us earlier, right? You can start to see those data points. You can locate the ones that are outside the norm, and you can start to see in an automated fashion who falls outside that norm.
And it's nice because these tools tend to be much more interactive. They're not static sitting on a piece of paper. You can actually poke and prod, touch each data point, look at the details, and then question whether or not that's something that you should care about. In an outlier, something that's an extreme data point, is this something that's okay, or is it something that you need to be concerned about? One of the things that we look at are drivers who buy a lot of gasoline. 10 times as many transactions as the average for a fleet. Well, that may be perfectly fine if this person sits in the maintenance department and they're responsible for repairing vehicles and fueling vehicles after they're repaired. They're supposed to have a large number of transactions. On the other hand, if you have a standard driver who's just doing their normal job and they're sitting out there at 10 times the normal volume, you may be wondering what's going on.
For me, what's great about this is just the simplicity of it. You know, you can log in, you can pull up your reports. They're all there at the click of a mouse, and you can quickly get to locating the cost of your overages and ways to optimize your fleet versus sitting around and trying to figure out Excel formulas.
I think, Jerry, you brought up the gamification. That's been a hot topic for the last year and a half. And we're seeing a lot of our customers are taking advantage of things like that scorecard, where they can compare driver to driver, they can compare region to region, office to office, cost center to cost center. And I think what we're also seeing is more of the carrot versus the stick.
Yep.
So it's great to call your drivers in and talk to them. And we've already highlighted 2 unfortunate driver situations. But we like to look at this one and say that we think this is somebody who might be doing a good job, and let's reward the good behavior and reinforce that.
Looks like there's a couple more outliers on that chart right there.
We'll focus on them next.
So one of the things I really love about my job is being out in the field, talking to customers, learning from them. And whether it's commercial fleets or government fleets, they all seem to be embracing data analytics for many different reasons. It could be driver safety, it could be cost savings, it could be accountability to stakeholders. Just last week I was talking to Ed Finnegan, who's in the Office of Fleet Management for the state of Georgia. And Ed actually illustrated a really interesting scenario to me. He mentioned that he was using that cost outlier report that we have available, and he noticed one transaction that was way outside the norm. So it was kind of floating out here and it looked very odd. So Ed decided to click on that transaction. First thing he noticed was that transaction was fuel at $6.29 a gallon. So of course, he immediately questioned the data, right? Something must be off. That's not possible. He looked at that transaction and went into more detail and saw that there were actually 3 drivers that fueled at that location at $6.29. So now it piqued his interest, right? So there's clearly a trend here. After going through that data and clicking through to the Google Maps image, which you can actually do in Clearview, he noticed that the marquee at that fuel station had $6.29 marked at the pump. So although Google Maps is sometimes dated, at the time that photo was taken, it actually matched up with his transactions. So Ed was able to do a couple things. Number 1, he was able to let the drivers know of their error. Number 2, he talked to his agencies and he communicated that fuel station and the problems that were occurring there. And number 3, not only that, but he was also able to use this as a scenario to reinforce the importance of this cost outlier report. Because of course, by going into the data early and being proactive, he was able to stop future transactions, and he was actually able to have tangible savings there. And he wanted to encourage the rest of his agencies to do the same thing.
That's a great story.
Yep. So I think for me, this really illustrates the power of data analytics, right? Going in and being able to identify savings using tools that are best in class. These tools are readily available. They're out there. Fleets all across the industry are using them. And so this can really help influence change in your organization. And Bernie, to your point, it can be a positive thing. It doesn't have to be negative, calling out drivers that have negative transactions. It can be a positive thing where you're basically calling out those drivers that are acting appropriately.
That's great. Okay.
So before we break, I just wanted to hand it over to Bernie and let you all know that we're going to be at NAFA in a couple weeks. It's a great show for us. We love going to the I&E Expo. It's in Tampa this year. WEX is going to be there. We've actually got some fun engagement. We've got a great game that we've prepared, and I think, Bernie, from what I understand, is you've been practicing this game.
I have been practicing. I'm not very good, but I have been practicing.
So all you have to do is beat him.
Just beat me.
We do have a little Beat Bernie challenge coming up. So those of you that are going to be in Tampa, stop by the booth and challenge Bernie at his own game.
It's going to be really fun. It's going to be great. Okay, so let's get to the question and answer portion of our presentation.
Right.
Here is the first question from our audience. So what are our plans for the future, and what's up next for WEX? I'm going to give that one over to you, Bernie.
So generically speaking, or are we focusing on the analytics side? I think I think as an organization, we continue to grow. All three lines of business that we spoke of earlier are globalizing. We're continuing to innovate with new products, trying to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. And I think in each of the three segments that we focus in, they're great markets. There's great competition there. There's a great need. I think we've got a ton of upside, and we're just going to continue to try to stay ahead of the market and continue to enhance our product set. And like we said, just globalize. I think on the analytics side specifically, we're really just at the beginning stages of what pieces of information we can take in. I know, Kurt, you probably get asked on a regular basis, hey, could you also include this? Could you also include that? It's been great, and it's been very interesting with some of the results that we've had. We've got great customers and great partners who are always willing to do more with us and want to do more, and they're just throwing data sets at us, and we just continue to tinker around with things and see what comes out.
From my point of view, I'm looking at basically two things right now. One is more and more data, more and more different kinds of data. How do we mix it together with what we already have? How do we make what we have better, bigger, stronger? And then when we do that analysis on that better, bigger, stronger data, how do we turn that into more and more actions? We talked about some very simple actions that you can do about messaging drivers, but there's a lot more. There's all the gamification stuff that has been discussed. There's integration with other systems. There's looking at other parts of the life cycle. So for us, it's a richness of all of this data. What questions can we answer? What behaviors can we influence? I think it's just an open green field for us right now.
Okay, great. Kurt, this question's for you. Does WEX tailor data reporting for individual use based on their operation and needs versus inherent software data reporting?
We do both custom reports for our customers as well as more broad application-based reporting, which is what the Clearview application is about. One of the things that we're big on is, as Bernie pointed out at the very beginning, the relationship. So we want to make sure that we're getting our customers the data that they want. So some do work with the data on their own. What we also want to do is give them the ability to answer as many questions as possible at the push of a button by just looking at the application and going into, say, a list of my worst drivers in terms of how much they're spending on premium gasoline, things like that. If we can make it easier for our customers to answer those questions, it frees up more time for the things that might be unique to each individual customer's needs.
I think one of the things that we're very mindful of is, as much as we want to do for our customers and partners, we don't know the business as well as they do. So I think any individual customer can take some of the analytics that we can provide and then apply it to their own business and usually have a different set of insights and actions that come from that.
One common theme I tend to hear is that we are definitely a trusted advisor, right? We work one-on-one with fleets to figure out what it is that can influence change and what it is that they actually need.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that we've done when we built our applications is that we've actively involved our customers. It isn't us coming up with an idea, turning it into a product, and then pushing it out in the marketplace. We actually run significant efforts around proof of concepts with our customers, sitting down with them, everything from paper prototypes, starting out with markers and drawing on pieces of paper, to standing up mock-ups of applications outside of the Clearview product itself, letting them play with it, interact with it for months before we get to something that we're comfortable releasing to the market. And all of that feedback comes from our customers. It's not from us.
Many of our customers love to be beta testers and test out our newest products.
Good point.
And how long do these kind of projects take? People are interested in knowing to get a data program off the ground using a software program?
It can be pretty quick. I mean, if you can start out with the data, that example that I mentioned earlier, it's not a fleet example, but the idea of pulling in the payroll and the HR databases and counting the number of employees, that took about a week. Probably 5 of those days were associated with just figuring out who to ask to get the data. And then you pull the data out, and then you throw it into a simple tool like a Tableau or a ClickView or something like that that's out there in the marketplace. You can get these answers very quickly. It's not that you're going to come up with, it's going to take a long time to come up with your first answer, but it's going to take a while before you're comfortable doing the analysis. I worked for a credit card company a while ago, and we figured it took about 2 years before our data scientists were really good at what they did. And that 2 years was spent getting comfortable with the data, knowing where it was weak, where it was strong. That was a pretty specialized example, though. I mean, you had to really know what you were doing. But when you did know what you were doing, these people were worth millions of dollars to us. On the other hand, you could probably get an interesting answer to a question 30 days into an analysis. That's going to lead to new questions, another 30 days. In a matter of a quarter, you should be able to be comfortable with getting answers to data. It may not be the ultimate answers, but you understand the process and you know what you can get.
But with data analytic programs like the one we've developed, those answers are basically there at the click of a mouse. We've done all the heavy lifting for the fleets.
That's true.
Yeah, well, I think what's also nice too is we talked earlier about the data set we have, and with over 500,000 customers, we've got a lot of benchmarking data that we can use as well. So while you say that an individual customer may be looking to analyze their own data and looking at trends, we can then also apply those same trends to industries, to geographies, to fleet sizes, things of that sort. So we kind of accelerate that learning curve, if you will, a little bit by the amount of data that we've got to help them. That's a great point.
So I have a question from the audience, another one. Several issues will have to be addressed to capture the full potential of big data. Policies related to privacy, security, intellectual property, and even liability will need to be addressed in a big data world. What's your view on this?
These are important questions. I've worked with multinational companies in the past, and just making sure that your data doesn't leak across the border when you're dealing with different privacy laws has been a big deal. That's certainly something that you have to be on top of. You have to know what is controlled, what is regulated, and what isn't. One of the things that we've tried to do is make sure that all of the data that sits in our Clearview application doesn't contain personally identifiable information. So we're not putting risky data in this environment, but you may start to think about, well, what other things can you add to the mix? When you start looking at telematics, when you start looking at accident data, what are the issues associated with privacy in those circumstances? It may be different than when you're looking at it simply from a fuel expenditure point of view. You have to be on top of this, and that's one of the things that we do. We invest in working with regulators, working with legal folks, working with our customers to make sure that we're on top of all of the implications.
We talked about security earlier, and security is paramount to everything we do. So we've got very secure data. I think where that question may also be leading is, so if I'm an employee and I've got a company vehicle and you've got a telematics device in there, do you have the right to track everywhere I go? You know, when does that stop? How much of that information are you able to access, or should you access? And I think really companies just need to ask themselves, is it a company-owned asset? Do they have the right to track that information because it is a company asset? And then maybe even more importantly than that is, am I providing a safer environment for my employees? And I think at some point we're going to start to see the industry change more towards, if we can better everybody and everybody gets information from this, the data sets that are available to make things safer, that would certainly alleviate some of those concerns. But there are things that we hear on a regular basis and we're addressing.
Yeah, one of the things that we've thought about is the ability to adjust the time frames for a scorecard. So your driver scorecard is only when they're on the clock, from 9 to 5. When they're using a company vehicle for personal use, maybe after hours, that doesn't get incorporated into a score.
So it's no longer that big brother.
Yeah, I think there's still that feeling, right? I mean, I think in the government space, right, there are different rules and regulations that apply. But I think it all comes down to working with the customers, understanding what the needs are. And I think the flexibility in the information that's available will usually get everybody to some sort of a solution that will benefit their organization.
Okay, great. So we heard a little bit about the level 3 data. Can you explain level 3 data more broadly?
Sure. Level 3 data is a term in the industry that just means enhanced data. So on a fueling standpoint, it's not just where you bought something, it's not just what you bought, it's capturing things like the odometer reading, it's capturing things like a driver ID. So then you can start to look at miles per gallon, cost per mile, do a little bit more with that data. A lot of basic banking cards or things of that sort may not have level 3 data universally. So you're going to be missing data sets. So Kurt had used an example earlier about, if you purchased a certain amount of fuel for the last year, we're just going to assume you're going to do that. We don't like to assume anything. If a data piece is missing from the string, we're not going to fill that in, right? We want to make sure we have that data. So at WEX, we talked about the closed loop and the proprietary spec. So we require level 3 data at 99.7% of all of our sites. So we're capturing that information, and it's just a more secure data set for us.
That's really the foundation of our fleet card program, right? Without that level 3 data, without that proprietary network, we would not be able to do things like Clearview because we'd be missing transaction data.
That's exactly right.
Actually, that detail is what drives a lot of the work that we do in analytics at WEX. The richness of the data, of level 3 data, gives us the ability to come up with more answers to more questions.
That's right.
Okay, great. Let's see. Here's another question from the audience. We often find that we spend time tracking down problems that are not actually problems. How do you handle bad or messy data?
Wow, that's a big question. I think that one of the points to that would be we don't know it's a problem, and you know your business a lot better. We'll provide you some data and then sit down with you and take more of a consultative approach to say, here's some things we found. Here were some outliers. Let us know whether that makes sense in your business or whether it doesn't make sense in your business. I think if you're going to pinpoint the data itself and there's a concern about messy data, then I think you need to get back to the source. So we just talked about the level 3 data.
Yeah.
So we know the source data for us on the fuel card side, let's pay attention to that, is good, clean data. So we know what we're getting back. So we feel comfortable about that. Kurt said earlier about trusting the data and understanding what it is that you're getting back. I would suggest that if there is data that comes back to you and it's not reliable or it isn't complete, then we need to get back to the source, and we probably don't want to integrate data like that in. So we're very mindful of that. When we take telematics data and integrate it with our fuel data, if there are missing elements to that, we won't integrate because that's just going to blur the picture and not really give you what you're looking for.
And like you always says, it comes down to the business. The business knows the business.
The business knows the business, yeah. And you need to sit with the businesses and not just have a cookie cutter approach and say, here, off the shelf, hope this works for you. We pride ourselves in our people and the support staff that we have, and we sit with our folks, our customers and our partners, and we say, what's going to work for you, and we build those solutions for them.
I feel like it's all about providing them with the right tools to help them to do their jobs and deal with those scenarios as they come up.
Exactly. It's on us in some ways to make sure that the data that flows through a tool like Clearview is right. I mean, that example that I showed of recoding those transactions from that station in Ohio that was coding everything as general merchandise, the reason that we did that was we have circumstances where a data point will come from a merchant saying you bought premium gasoline, and so you can list that for the drivers who are supposedly buying premium gasoline. You can go yell at that driver, and the driver's going to say, I didn't buy premium gasoline. So then you've got, well, is the driver lying or is the data lying? And you want to make sure that the data is solid. So we actually built those machine learning models to recode those transactions so that when we did claim that a driver bought premium gasoline, we were certain that they bought premium gasoline. And we'll do that in a variety of data areas. We'll do it for other things beyond sort of the product code.
That's great.
And like we like to say, we're just getting started. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank NAFA for hosting us today and thank our panelists.
Thank you, Molly.
Welcome. And everyone, keep an eye out for an email from NAFA that will have a link to today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.